And welcome to All In, the economics behind the modern gambling industry. In this segment, we're going to be exploring the relationship between government, technology, and how they affect gambling in the United States. We've got a special guest with us today who's interested in learning about gambling and how it works, and he's looking to strike it rich. Let's meet him.
Hi, I'm Peter. I work at the local steel mill, and I'm looking to strike it rich in the casino. It's pretty boring work over at United States Steel Company, and wish me luck today.
So let's begin. Why do people gamble? You have to consider a multitude of factors, such as personality factors, educational history, substance abuse, and covariates, which are additional factors which are seen in coalition with the aforementioned ones. Impulsivity, ADHD, and use of all three substances, tobacco, alcohol, and marijuana, all led to an increased incidence of gambling addiction, and specifically, when seen together, the highest incidence of gambling addiction was seen. In Peter's case, he's a blue-collar worker with an 8th grade education and a history of tobacco use, so he would be at a high risk to develop a gambling addiction. Looking at this study that relates the incidence of gambling addiction to the aforementioned factors, we see that people with ADHD were 64% more likely to develop a gambling addiction, and people with high impulsivity were 82% more likely to develop a gambling addiction. So if Peter's not careful, he could potentially be into some trouble. We need to understand the government relationship with gambling in the past to understand current climate. So prior to 1969, gambling was largely regulated by the states, and not by the federal government. The Corporate Gaming Act of 1969 permitted publicly traded corporations to hold gambling licenses for the first time, but only in Nevada. This greatly reduced the stigma of gambling as it seemed like it was more legal. Nevada licensees in 1977 were finally permitted to operate elsewhere, and this sparked massive growth in the industry across the country. After the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act was passed, more growth in the industry was promoted, as many of the current casinos and gambling sources today are operated by Indian tribes or native groups. We can observe this growth by the numbers. There was significant growth in the industry by 1998, as in Las Vegas and Atlantic City, the gambling industry rose to a value of $9.5 billion. The pre-federal tax income was $860 million in Las Vegas alone in 1998. This growth was supported by loose governmental regulation due to an increased tax revenue. By 2010, the industry was valued at $125 billion, which is 1% of GDP at that time.
So let's talk to an expert, Representative Dwayne Milne from the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives and the 167th District. Let's see what his overall stance on the issue is.
Yeah, so the Appropriations Committee is what we call the Budget Committee for Pennsylvania. And then the Finance Committee basically deals with tax issues and tax code matters. And commerce is a lot to do with business development. So the focus of that group. Sure. My stance has always been actually to be voting against the gambling issues in the state. So just from that perspective, I just want to put that out from the beginning. I don't actually happen to favor using gambling as a way to raise revenue for the state. So I've consistently voted against the initial gambling and then a number of the proposals since that would expand it in different ways.
Well, let's explain it by visiting a hypothetical casino and a principle called the house advantage. So at this casino, the gambler decides to place an initial wager of $1, which the house matches with their own $1. The total pot becomes $2. Let's say the gambler wins this round. It's his lucky day. He gets $2 and is now up a net $1. He decides to play again and places his wager of $2. The house matches that once again, and the total pot becomes $4. This time the house wins, as is inevitable due to the odds, and the house is now up a net $1, whereas the gambler is down a net $1. So when you factor in multiple rounds of betting, multiple patrons, much higher bets, you get an increased taxable income, which leads to increased government revenue. and this shows why governments are so reluctant to regulate the industry, as so much of their budget is subsidized by this increased taxable income that comes from these gambling sources and the house advantage. The gambling industry is very subject to trends based on external factors. Economic downturns can lead to decreased activity in the gambling sector due to decreased disposable income. Economic upswings can lead to increased activity due to increased disposable income. Technology also alters the way we gamble, with improvements in technology improving our accessibility, frequency, and the convenience with which we gamble. The development of online gambling sites has led to new phenomena and new controversies surrounding the gambling industry. Increased technological capabilities have made gambling easier, with increased options and ability to spend without physical cash or in-person transactions. These gambling sources are also able to offer perks, player analytics, and use a demographic approach to target patrons who might be willing to spend more, which makes them more able to generate revenue quickly.
We're waiting to see, because that's actually one of the issues that we may be voting on later this year. Pennsylvania really doesn't have the online gambling yet, like some other states. That obviously is because of the experience in other states. That obviously is a big push right now. So we're waiting to see what kind of authorizations we will allow for online gambling in Pennsylvania. I suspect it is going to pass. I will not be voting for it, but I suspect it will pass. And yes, I do think you'll see that will take a quick increase of users that will pull from the online sort of so-called physical plant casinos. Just always more convenient, it's easier access, you don't have to go anywhere.
Now, you would think that the proliferation of online gambling sites would lead to increased tax revenue, right? Well, maybe not. Online gambling sites are difficult to regulate, and there's an ethical issue as many legislators are unwilling to support vice activities. There's the potential for great growth when regulated, but there's also the argument that it facilitates exploitation and illegal activity. So legislators need to reconcile these differences. Let's talk to Representative Milne and see what he has to say on the issue.
Part of it, though, is partly the principle about whether you think the public sector, government, should be encouraging these kind of behaviors as a way to raise revenue. If people want to do it completely on their own, that's obviously their choice as an individual. As a matter of principle, I just don't happen to think government should be raising money through so-called vice activities, including gambling. I think we're also going to find that as all states rush to do more and more of this, the reality is you could have declining revenues over time, because there's a lot of market saturation happening right now, where so many surrounding states to Pennsylvania are all expanding gambling in all kinds of different forms, that we're going to see a decline of the total number of dollars. Yeah, I think you'll see eventually what's going on in Atlantic City right now, which is Atlantic City is completely plummeting because now there's so many more options besides going to Atlantic City. There are only so many entertainment dollars available. I think we're going to see a decline in it over time. And I also don't think that the cost side of this gets taken into account enough, because there are costs to encouraging the gambling.
Okay, so you're a Republican member of the House,
Right.
Do you think that your political identity has anything to determine your view on this, as opposed to what your Democratic counterparts might have?
To be fair, Representative Milne is a value-based legislator who does feel that gambling should not be supported by the government. But if we look purely by the numbers in a state that has legalized online gambling, say New Jersey, we can see that online gambling revenue over the years has been steadily increasing. But we don't know if this will persist in other states that have different gambling cultures and different histories of gambling. Though the data is impressive and significant, we can't be sure that the same will apply to different states.
No, I don't think there's really any party affiliation that makes a difference here. There are people from both parties that have the same basic stance I do. They're skeptical about relying on gambling. Conversely, the people from both parties that are supporting it and trying to encourage more of it. So really, I think it's really just personal preferences as much as anything.
Differences in opinion of legislators on this issue come more from regional differences and value-based differences than political affiliation. There's a gray area in federal law where the policy on gambling is dependent on state governments. Nevada and New Jersey have legalized online gambling, while in other states it is illegal. Unless there's a unified federal law, the government's response to online gambling will always be disjointed. A unified federal law would govern the issue and end the controversy rather than propagating it for years. In regards to the issue of whether to support gambling, to support online gambling, or just to support brick-and-mortar casinos and gambling sources, there's no perfect option. Commercial gambling venues have their own problems with crime and decreased property values in casino counties. Online gambling sites could lead to illegal activity and are perceived to facilitate gambling addictions as they make gambling easier. Now, both sources generate strong revenue both in the industry and in taxes, but the government is split on support of vice activities versus economic benefits. Unless we overcome these differences, there will be no solution offered. Before we can offer potential solutions, we need to understand the dilemma. There's a divide on how the industry should be regulated despite its profitability. Value-based legislators do not support decreased regulation, even though there's a certain amount of deregulation required for the industry to succeed. Legislators concerned primarily with revenue are in favor of deregulation, even though a certain amount of regulation is required to appease both sides of the aisle. Workers in the gambling industry believe that deregulation and legalization of online gambling will be economically beneficial, but they overlook the political and societal implications of such a decision. Now, who's right? Who's to say? It's a big decision, and we need to contemplate an important solution. Luckily, there is a solution that is as easy as ABC. The premise of activity-based costing says that both parties will be better off when they maximize revenue-generating activities while decreasing expensive activities. In relation to government and the modern gambling industry, the gambling sources of revenue are increased patronage and consumer spending, which is boosted by online gambling. And the gambling industry expenses are property costs and taxation. Conversely, the government revenue sources are taxes, and their expenses are heavy regulations and restrictions that they place on the gambling industry. Both parties would be better off if they maximized what made them money and decreased what lost their money. Activity-based costing can be abstract in its concept, but we can represent it visually using the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve is an economic theory that relates the rate of taxation to tax revenue. There is a revenue maximizing point in the middle. At 0% taxation, there is zero tax revenue as the government is not making any money. At 100% tax rate, the government is also making zero in tax revenue because all incentive for business profits in the gambling industry has been diminished. So in relation to the modern gambling industry and the relationship with government, the revenue maximization point would be the point at which activity-based costing is working optimally. The government is making the most it can at the highest tax rate it can, while the gambling industry and the gambling sources are making the most money they can and spending the least they have to in taxes, while still being able to make the most of the resources provided to them with online gambling. Activity-based costing is working at the maximum revenue point, as at this point the government is maximizing its revenue-generating sources and taxes, and minimizing its expenses in heavy regulations and restrictions which it would have to impose on the gambling industry. The gambling industry also is maximizing its revenue-generating sources by being able to take advantage of the online gambling opportunities, but they're also minimizing their expenses by not having to spend as much in taxes by accommodating a little bit of restriction. In this way, a sustainable solution has been offered, as both parties are made better off as long as each adheres to their side of the deal. Now that we've identified a potential solution, we can make some qualitative predictions about what would happen if this solution were instituted. The gambling source net revenue comes from their revenue minus expenses times 1 minus the tax rate, because this is what they're left over with after the government has taken its cut of taxes. Government revenue comes from the gambling source revenue times the tax rate minus regulation expenses, whatever they have to spend to restrict the industry. So what if online gambling were legal but restricted? Then the gambling source revenue would go up because it's supplemented by the online gambling. Tax revenue would go up because they're getting greater cut of the gambling industry's revenue. And expenses and regulation would be proportionally extremely small. As gambling source revenue goes up, tax revenue goes up, and expenses are then seen as a smaller percentage of the total budget. Now, we've approached this topic very macroeconomically and on a broad scale. All solutions offered have merely been courses of strategy for which specific policy directives could follow. We can make some overall conclusions now, however. The gambling industry greatly contributes to the economy. Government and technology have great influence over the industry and how it works, or how profitable it could be. Online gambling sites have changed the scene and brought new revenue sources, as well as greater controversy. If concerns about fomentation of illegal activity can be addressed, the gambling industry could become more profitable in terms of jobs, consumer spending, and tax revenue, which would make the industry better off as a whole, as well as the entire economy. So I hope this was informative and that you learned a lot. Thanks for watching.